My dad doesn't game, doesn't read fiction, and usually only watches action movies. So let's just say 10-year-old me was extremely surprised the day my dad came home with a copy of Myst in his hand that he'd gotten from our local Sam's Club. Something about the cover art had spoken to him, entangled his imagination, and soon it would do the same to me. Being a kid, I'd really only played, the Dark Forces games, Amazon and Oregon Trail, and some educational games. So when my dad and my younger brother and I gathered around the computer and fell through that fissure for the first time into Myst, let's just say our horizons were broadened. We'd never seen anything like it. It's no small irony that this team of a father and two sons took to exploring the island of Myst, a place left to ruin after a father and his two sons had a falling out over how to steward the many different fantastical worlds that all link to the island, and were accessible only through their handed-down ability to link to these worlds from the books that they wrote. Over 20 years later, my mind's eye can still see all the sights, like the docks of Myst Island you first find yourself on, the gulls welcoming you, the mast of the nearby ship quivering in the wind, the sun shimmering on the water. I can still hear the crackle of static-filled messages left behind in the library from the two brothers, each trying to get you to believe their side of the story. I also chuckled at the awkwardness of a dentist chair being in the middle of this otherwise futuristic-looking place. Most vividly, I remember the fascinating but for some reason frightening account to me of the monkey-like creatures in Channelwood who lived in tree houses above the water and appeared peaceful, but kept me looking up into the trees for any trace of their presence, as if I was worried that the intense emptiness of this place might have indicated some hidden malice, some catastrophe. More than anything, I remember the incredible feeling of wonder and yet sublime loneliness, of looking for meaning and belonging in a place that seemed to have been undone by its industry, not enlightened or enriched by it. Efficiency and expansion had driven men mad with curiosity, and in order to justify your existence as the player, you had to engage your own curiosity and hope not to succumb to the temptations of power. I don't think I've ever played a game that's done more with so much negative space. This carved out hole in your knowledge compels you further. Your cup needs filling, and you need to drink deep from Myst. And I've taken quite a few swigs these past 20-some-odd years, even if only recalling my brief but fond memories of the place. Now, by their own admission, Myst co-creators, brothers Rand and Robyn Miller, couldn't possibly conceive that Myst would become one of the most important video games ever made. But as Rand later joked,
I've heard this game's pretty interesting, unless you're a hater.
So how interesting was it? Well, Myst was the doom of point-and-click adventure games, the standard by which the quality of all previous genre entries were reevaluated and to which new ones would be compared. Hell, Myst even outsold the preposterously popular Doom in the 90s, and Doom was classically known to be on more computers than even Windows 95 was at one point. Myst would go on to be the highest-selling PC game of the 90s, outselling Doom 2 in 1995, Warcraft in 96, and only being unseated by its own sequel Riven in 1997. It was the highest-selling PC game ever until 2002, when it was finally eclipsed by The Sims.
Ow! Oh! Me too.
Since then, Myst has only increased its cultural footprint, being re-released more times in Skyrim and in a huge variety of packages, some including night and day cycles in a flashlight, one turning it into a 3D walking simulator, or even a VR version. Myst has even spawned a forthcoming documentary and even a shitpost version of itself called Myst FPS that you can play on itch.io. Myst FPS features a metal soundtrack, tons of enemies to shoot, and makes fun of the original game's brutal puzzle difficulty by calling out cerebral after you've killed 10 demons in a row. Beating the game even generates a very snarky link to Mensa. Oh, you guys. But what's most amazing about Myst's impact is that its no combat, no fail-state puzzle and exploration gameplay flourished in an industry that was trending towards the immediate satisfaction of shooters like Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, which the Myst FPS is modeled after. Ironically, while the FPS trend may have ended up killing point-and-click adventure's appeal for good, the Myst series hung in there, a staunch pioneer against an encroaching FPS wilderness. And yet, it's not quite a game that you can just wave around a copy and 90% of gamers are just going to swoon at. Cynical modern gamers can and have dismissed it as obtuse, pretentious, and even disastrous for the adventure game genre. Rock Paper Shotgun co-founder John Walker famously wrote that he hated Myst so much that he wanted to, quote, hunt down the creators and throw them into a volcano. Strong words for a guy who doesn't even know that the game is actually called Rock Paper Scissors. What a noob. I've even seen in multiple places that Game Center said in 2000 that Myst killed the point-and-click adventure genre. Medium even reported that an event called Are Adventure Games Dead? At GDC 1998 saw Sanitarium's Travis Williams say that Myst and Riven insulted him, that they were just a, quote, whole bunch of pretty pictures around those wooden peg puzzles. A Mindscape employee echoed this sentiment shortly thereafter, saying they weren't even adventure games at all. Sounds like these guys belong in a sanitarium. Am I right, Miss Faithful?
High five.
In a 2013 Verge interview, Rand Miller addressed claims of this nature as, quote, kind of weird. We got accolades for increasing exposure of what was called the adventure game, and then we got blamed for the death of the adventure game because it was too big and too hard to top it. Must be a nice problem to have, huh? But if nobody's claiming that Doom killed first-person shooters by spawning endless Doom clones, then what's the disconnect with Myst? Well, I think it's partly because, unlike the LucasArts style of adventure games like Indiana Jones, The Secret of Monkey Island, Sam & Max, or Full Throttle, Myst wasn't particularly funny, lighthearted, cinematic, or interested in engaging the player in a direct manner. And the fact that Myst kept selling to a market that seemed to have spontaneously generated out of thin air was a source of much sourness across the industry. Other companies tried desperately to imitate Myst's success unsuccessfully, whether it be games like Obsidian, John Saul's Blackstone Chronicles, Black Dahlia, Dust, Starship Titanic, Lighthouse, or Zork Nemesis. So what does Myst offer that's so hard to pin down, so inimitable, so inimitable? You probably shouldn't put words on a script you can't say. So inimitable, so indomitable. My answer is concise and decidedly less full of $10 words, but not necessarily simple. The enduring quality of Myst is its intangibility. I guess I should say that Myst allure is full of intangibles. A weird, once-in-a-lifetime alchemy that the Millers were destined for, called to, if you will. Myst had a first-person view unlike the LucasArts staples. It had pensive music, fantastical lore, and a bizarrely familiar yet alien world that created a sense of curious disillusionment in me when I first played those 20-some-odd years ago. There's a cold yet compelling spell woven by Myst cobbled-together art style, its abandoned state practically begging you to return its machines to life again. But despite how Myst makes me feel,
I've got another confession to make.
I don't like playing Myst.
How dare you!
The puzzles are just often full of space logic, or require incredibly specific timing, and are often inscrutable in what effect one flip switch had elsewhere in the world. They often do not feel like a game made for non-gamers, much less gamers, despite what the Miller brothers say. And yet, I can't help but be compelled to come back and engage with its mystique, no pun intended. Okay, maybe a little bit intended. And it's this disconnect from the dislike of playing Myst and the joy of being in Myst that I want to explore today. Even if Myst's popularity stifled innovation in its genre, or it plays like an aged and paltry thing like the haters say, then what about it is so appealing to the senses, the imagination, and even the intellect that's caused it to endure for so long? I had to go to great lengths to justify my own gut feeling beyond the vague observations I just made, and that meant delving deep into the inspirations for its concept, the fascinating limitations of its creation, and what it reveals to us about what we are probably lacking in today's industry that we need to recapture. This search also meant trying to figure out if I can laud something as great, even if I don't like the large majority of it. So come with me as I reckon with what Myst is, and why it should matter to me as it has to countless others for 30 years now. So let's open our books to page arbitrary number and get sucked down the Starfisher for an age or two, down into the surrealistic adventure that will become your world, down into Myst. Solving the mystery of Myst's enduring nature has to start at its creative genesis, which is, of course, my favorite part of any 90s video game retrospective. The story starts with two brothers, Robyn and Rand Miller. They were the sons of a traveling evangelical Christian pastor who encouraged them to test their beliefs and ideas through vigorous debate, perhaps preparing them for the endurance that they would later exhibit during Myst's development, where they had to work against technological constraints and iterate around them. But Robyn and Rand were quite different. Ran was the eldest, and Robyn was the second youngest of 4 brothers. Right before the brothers joined forces to make Cyan Productions, Ran was a computer programmer at a Texas bank who had grown up in awe of the magic of playing and creating video games, even hacking his University of New Mexico computer lab to play Lunar Lander at one point. Robyn was more introverted and artsy, staying close to home in Washington and enjoying painting, playing guitar, and drawing sketches of fantastic places. According to Wired's Gorillas in the Myst article, the 2 brothers didn't even know each other that well, so it was something of a surprise when Rand called Robyn up one day from the other side of the country and said that he'd love for Robyn to illustrate a sort of interactive storybook game idea he was working on. Not quite knowing what this is supposed to look like, Robyn drew a couple of environments in Mac's HyperCard program instead of just drawing isolated pictures illustrating the narrative. Robyn sent them back to Rand saying, "It's better this way." As Wired put it, Rand agreed. The older brother deferred to the younger brother. A partnership was formed. So the first step towards the Cyan Productions way of doing things was taken, which was create a world not so much before story, but create a world that tells a story through its physicality. The brothers soon decided that they liked the concept of an open blue sky and named their 2-man development studio Cyan Productions in 1987. In 1988, they made their first big move as a studio. The first pitch that Ram sent to Robyn was turned into a game called Manhole, which started to take form as Robyn made sketch after sketch. The most important image he dreamed up was a manhole with a vine growing out of it, and he discovered that it begged the question of whether he should go up or down. Robyn realized that nonlinear exploration was something he wanted to include in his game, saying the medium essentially called out for it. And so the game started to revolve around this beanstalk being the point of travel between fantastic worlds. Sounds a bit like Myst, doesn't it? The brothers soon realized that they weren't just making an interactive book with Manhole, they were making a world, and one that begged to be explored. So they took Manhole to an expo in San Francisco, and they promptly sold out. A publisher even approached them with a $20,000 publishing deal, which was a big deal to them at the time. It would go on to win the Software Publishers Association Award in 1998 for Best New Use of a Computer. Not only did the boys realize that they were onto something, but the experience helped them solidify the core tenets of Cyan's game development philosophy going forward. Number 1, point-and-click first-person perspective. Number 2, player is the main character, no avatar. And 3, everything is explorable. They would go on to implement these concepts and refine their HyperCard prowess in 1989's Cosmic Osmo and the Worlds Beyond the Mackerel. But although these games were critically successful and were important milestones as some of the first kids' games on CD-ROM, the brothers wanted to start making more complex games for older audiences. In 1990, they even pitched Activision a game called Grey Summons, which had a non-linear story starring the player as the protagonist, in which you were emotionally provoked to make choices with important consequences. Activision loved the idea so much that they told the Millers to stick to kids' games, what they were good at. Never change, Activision, and give us Raven Software back while you're at it, you chumps. So the boys went back to their proven field of expertise and experimented with in-game lore books and spelunks, a 1991 game that would be finished the same year that the Millers started working on Myst. No one would try to catch the next wave of Cyan's proposed career direction until Sunsoft, who'd funded a Japanese version of Manhole, paid them a surprise visit to offer funding for what would become Myst. The boys were quite nervous, but Sunsoft only had one question for them about Myst. Is it going to be better than The Seventh Guest? Now you may be thinking, I'll take references I don't get for $500, Alex, and I'd be right there with you. For context, Seventh Guest is a 1993 adventure game that helped to popularize the CD-ROM format alongside Myst. It was essentially an interactive horror movie with puzzles, and by 1995, it had actually outsold Myst 1.5 million copies to 1.1. Now, I have to admit, I don't know how it's possible that Seventh Guest supposedly didn't get popular until it was previewed at the 1992 Consumer Electronics Show, and the Sunsoft meeting happened before that in 1991, but let's just assume that everybody's telling the truth here and just enjoy our 2020 hindsight. Sunsoft thought the Seventh Guest was a big deal, which it turned out to be, and you know what the Nervous Brothers said in response to whether their game would be as good? Oh yeah, it's going to be better. The sack lunches on these boys, I tell you. Their confidence was promptly rewarded with a generous grant from Sunsoft valued at about $250 to $265K, though final costs were considerably more according to Robyn Miller's GDC talk. Ironically, though the Millers were boyishly confident in their game's success and had made a 7-page proposal of top-down maps for their Sunsoft meeting, it's unclear how much of the game had actually been thought out and created beyond its basic design tenets. I say that because Myst's story, art style, and level design seemed fairly liquid at the beginning of development. Part of Myst's unconventional design can be attributed to how Rand Miller describes he and his brother's artistic perspective. Their core audience was non-gamers, and to a large degree they were making this for themselves, who were hardly hardcore gamers either. But this and other unconventionalities are what made Myst so special. For instance, unlike most games which were often inspired by movies like Doom was by Aliens and Evil Dead 2, Myst influences were largely literary, or based on experimentation with Dungeons & Dragons design, or D&D design, because my gatekeeping wife said I have to say that because no one says Dungeons & Dragons. The Millers were also inspired by the wardrobe in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia series, a portal between worlds. Myst featured not only a strange fissure into which Atris and the player fell to reach the island, but also the books which acted as gateways to the various ages. The Lord of the Rings played a big role here too, according to Rand. The Lord of the Rings felt like you were just experiencing a small window into a much larger world, and for some reason that really resonated with us. That made these worlds seem so much more real to us. And so, when it came time to do our worlds, that's naturally where we land. We build backstory and wrap stuff around the family and what had happened, stuff that didn't even need to be told in the little window of the Myst game. But in our world, it gave it weight, and I love that. The last and most obvious influence on Myst feel were the books of Jules Verne, like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, From the Earth to the Moon, and The Mysterious Island. Mysterious Island. Sinking in yet?
Myst Island. Ha ha ha!
The Industrial Revolution, inventor-punk nature of Myst's world feels like it leapt off the pages of these books, and it's no doubt why the phone call between the brothers where they decided on the name Myst was so brief, so instinctual.
In just even the name, I don't know, it was like a 30-second phone call where it's just like, hey, what should we name it? How about Myst? Okay, good. You know?
So Myst had a name and a vibe, but it remained to be seen what it would play like. After all, Robyn was a writer and a visual artist who had played hardly any games besides the text-adventure Zork 2, which Rand also enjoyed alongside the grandfather of the genre, a 1976 Colossal Cave adventure. Rand loved that these games didn't feel like nondescript grids, but actual worlds. He was such a lover of world building, in fact, that when he played D&D as a child, he refused to use dice or stat sheets, instead drawing maps like this one that would become the basis of Myst's mechanical age. Playing this way, Rand would attempt to create an immersive play experience that hinged on the players playing as themselves and relying on their own intuition and ingenuity, unfettered by arbitrary stat crunching, numbers, and random chance. Rand carried this philosophy into Myst's design too. He maintains that he and Robyn really weren't, quote, game designers. We were place designers, so we just started drawing maps, and the maps kind of fueled the story. Robyn and Rand would start out with a backwards approach of planning out buildings and then crafting a story around the building's characteristics. The narrative then became a justification for all these imaginatively disparate places to be tied together. Now we'll go into the story more deeply later on, but the hook that the Millers devised to link all of Myst's diverse geographies, species, and technologies together was the art. The art was a special talent that only some could learn, which is to write linking books that let people travel from our world into these fascinating pre-existing places that could then be influenced by the writer, a very Alan Wakian affectation. But they couldn't just be awe-inspiring to look at. They had to feel functional and have an internal consistency to them. Rand Miller admits that the art design was fairly eclectic, kind of like flipping through the pages of National Geographic. You know, a spaceship on one side of the island and a tree elevator on another, but always possessing a certain magic that stokes the imagination while disconcerting its presuppositions about what should go where. The Millers paid special attention to making the interface as undistracting as possible so that the player was dialed in and open to the strangeness of this world. So, Myst had simple mouse controls, an almost invisible interface, and no gamey barriers to progression. Macworld praised Myst for, quote, removing the most annoying part of adventure games, vocabularies that you don't understand, people you can't talk to, wrong moves that get you killed and make you start over. You try to unravel the enigma of the island by exploring the island, but there's no time pressure to distract you, no arbitrary punishments in your way. Myst really embodied the phrase, let him cook. In fact, the puzzles, the real core of the gameplay, were constructed to be friction for the player to get them to stop and contemplate why the world worked this way and how, not merely to be a gamey contrivance to be overcome. Now, we'll talk more later about how well this balance was achieved, but such was the Millers' goal. They'd felt the tone and sense of the puzzles were far too segregated from the storytelling aspect of Seventh Guest, and they wanted to do one better. And despite how hard many people find the puzzles, it's been reported that a lot of grandmas joined the 20 to 30-somethings and children that made up Myst's unprecedented player base. So I'd say the Millers made the right gamble by betting on accessibility and immersion. Not many people can boast that they created some gamer grannies in their lifetime. Now, we'll get into the story and puzzle specifics later, but we do need to spend time unpacking just how daunting a task it was to make this grand of a vision with the seemingly limited technologies at hand.
Living within constraints is probably, it's like the name of the game.
Living within constraints became Rand's motto throughout this arduous process. He didn't see tech limitations as barriers to progression, though, but merely a rule of the game, and you had to learn how to play the game just like anything else. So here's how the Millers learned to play this game in order to make it their game. Now, to their benefit, the QuickTime format came out mid-development, and that meant that they could make and easily use the FMV story scenes that the brothers acted in themselves, or even add flourishes like a window inside the elevators that showed you the floors passing by outside as you went down. But things didn't go nearly as smoothly for the rest of Myst graphics. Early on, Robyn assumed that no computer program could keep up with the artistic demands that Myst had, so he planned to hand-draw the whole thing in the style of Hergé's fantastic Tintin comic books. Fortunately, Robyn first experimented with the Max Stratavision 3D program before doing all of that work, and found that he could make the entirety of Myst Island using grayscale extrusion, which created variations of height and depth to what was essentially a blanket of texture that you could kind of drape over building blocks. And once Rand added bump mapping to the assets to give them realistically imperfect 3D textures, the brothers never looked back and leaned into the program like a second language. Now, the players saw the game world as they had in Cyan's previous work. Static shots linked together with transition animations to simulate motion or to just change the scene. But these images took up a ton of space, and the Millers had to greatly reduce the wireframes used in them in order to make them fit. But any change like this would take minutes to show up on screen, making editing a tedious process. The biggest obstacle of all was that no matter how compressed they were, these images still took forever to render for use in game, and you couldn't be both working on crafting these images and also letting others render in the background at the same time. So the renders, which took anywhere from 2 to 14 hours to complete, often had to be left overnight to finish. Eventually it got to the point where Robyn had to bring in multiple computers to edit while the others rendered. But the work wasn't over when these images finished rendering. There was still the matter of the transition animations to link these images together. Unfortunately, the HyperCard program they were building with didn't do color, and more importantly, its speed didn't allow for fluid transitions between scenes, which is not what you want from a game that's all about pointing and clicking and getting an immediate result. So they enlisted a gentleman named John Miller, no relation, who got these transitions working with what's called X commands or external functions that hacked in color and transitions at the proper speed. Notably, the PC version was actually able to run all these transitions flawlessly without all the extra coding that the Mac and HyperCard needed, which is a good thing too, as they were inching towards the PC and the new CD-ROM format more and more as they went along. For instance, once Rand moved to Washington for Myst development, he lived on a hill in a double-wide trailer and had a courier ferry 1 GB sized Jazz Disk hard drives of Myst stuff back and forth between he and Robyn's houses. They used these Jazz drives for a time because single-speed CD-ROM was, quote, enabling but somewhat frightening. It was made for music, not data storage, and it was very slow. Hard drives were indexed. CD-ROMs were not made to jump to any part of the drive quickly, just go in a spiral.
It's not a loop, it's a spiral.
But once the boys realized that the CD-ROM was the way of the future and that PCs played well with their transitions whereas the Mac lagged behind, they ditched their Jazz drives and leaned into the PC and CD-ROM space. To accommodate the slow read speed, they conceptualized Myst Island as a hub area and segmented the major levels that you would go to, known as ages, out by themselves. But even compartmentalizing the game into smaller pieces didn't solve the speed problem, as they couldn't just put all sound assets together or all graphics in one place on the disk. The Millers had to orientate all assets related to a particular area close to each other on the disk so that the laser reader would get to them all as soon as possible. Again, living within constraints and adjusting as needed was the name of the game. Myst was technically the name of the game, but you know what I mean. In keeping with that theme, the Millers did many things themselves when it came to production, including the music and even playing the game's characters in the FMVs. Now, Myst didn't actually have music initially, as the Millers thought that it would be totally unimmersive to have non-diegetic music pulling people out of the world. But their publisher Broederbund asked the boys to humor them and just see how it felt. Robyn recalls making some tracks and just pre-reveling in how it was going to prove it would suck. But as it turns out, his music actually made the experience far more enjoyable. Who knew, right? All the music mixing was done internally on the Proteus MPS Plus and was recorded at night over a 2-week span. And if nothing else entices you about Myst, the music should certainly do so. I know it was incredibly inspiring and relaxing while writing this script, which is something I think only Signalis can boast for me so far. But while Robyn banged out all the music for Myst, the Millers didn't do everything themselves. Early on, they hired another artist named Chuck Carter and a sound mixer named Chris Brandkamp, whom they met at church. Not only did Chris also work as Cyan's accountant, but he was also an accomplished carpenter. He even built Cyan World Headquarters, the small garage-sized office space that they often worked from. But back to his sound mixing, Chris had to wait until all the visuals were completed to make sure his sounds made contextual sense. What he came up with was pretty interesting.
I just whapped it, and it had such a reverberant sound. Of course, it was too high. I just dropped the sound lower and lower and lower till he had this big, nice bell sound.
The crackling fire of the boiler room was created by driving over gravel. The sound the fireplace tiles make is air being released from a compressor tank like one you'd see from a staple gun. And the planetarium or dentist chair room uses the sound of a dentist drill to account for the whirring sound that the console makes when the date changes. The sound effects are unusual but pristine, and Rand even said he made countless layers of sound to get the elevators just right. Funnily enough, Robyn also contributed his own voice and layered in tons of effects to get that classic warping sound that the books make when you travel between ages.
Like, like I literally did that for the original sound.
We'll go into this more in the puzzle section, but sound wasn't just a highly realistic and thus immersive tool. It was very important mechanically to solve puzzles, especially the infamous Maze Runner puzzle that relied on knowing what sounds represented what directions. And much like how people say sound is the most important aspect of a YouTube video, sound is especially so when looking at a series of still images like Myst. The depth and quality of the sound means that this isn't just a book you're playing through, it's more like virtual reality or a movie that just so happens to let your imagination create the connective tissue between the images as they change. Voice acting was a huge part of the game's charm too. As you may have noticed, the three characters, Atris, Cirrus, and Akinar, that show up in the game all look familiar. And that's because Robyn and Rand played these guys themselves, Rand playing Atris and Akinar, and Robyn playing Cirrus. We're kind of embarrassed about it, Rand admitted. Robyn continued that the fact that we got anything that looked good out of what we did is a miracle. It was just me and Rand, really, and the thing I remember most is that we were just laughing hysterically through it. Rand agreed. Looking back, in spite of the fact that we would not have cast ourselves had we had a real budget, it's cool again that we as brothers got to play those brothers and look back and laugh at it. I've got tapes.
Oh! No!
The mistake was your belt's lost, sir.
And as time wore on and technological advancements were adjusted to and taken advantage of, development became much more about testing how simple and clear it was to all players. Drawing from their unconventional D&D past, the Millers essentially dungeon mastered two game testers through a paper version of the game to see how they reacted, presenting them with choices of how to interact and where to go. And even when people started playing the actual game, the Millers always tested with two people who could, talk to each other and get engaged and problem solve and trade ideas freely in the moment. They even got to where they could fix problems on the fly.
If they're here and they clicked here to go to the planetarium, it's like, okay, great, we didn't make that work because this is the button to go to the planetarium. We could just step in immediately and we could fix that.
Bruderbund even focus group tested the game, and the bros were crushed when the first group didn't like it.
Oh no, they hated the game. It was really discouraging. And they brought group 2 in, and man, this group they loved it. And I think that was the first time Rand and I got this sense that, wow, this might sell like 100,000 copies. Maybe we'll make our money back, or maybe we can do another game after this. We were so happy.
Bruderbund also tried some silly slogans like the surrealistic adventure will become your world. Robyn hated the sales pitchiness of it, but grew to start using this phrase that Bruce Fredericks came up with as time went on. It was, as the testers said, quote, unlike anything on the market, a totally different paradigm. And as I said before in the intro, and to which you can likely already attest as a gamer watching YouTube videos about one of the most important games ever made, Myst kind of went off. But as we've already acknowledged the sales numbers and cultural impact, let's now really dig into the interesting stuff, which is the experience itself and why it engaged so many. I'm talking story hook and gameplay, bro. As we noted earlier, the Millers set out to make an interactive storybook when they first started making games, and drew from the imaginative fiction of C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and Verne as they made Myst. That drove them to create an equally fantastic bed of lore for the Myst series to roll around in, one that was helped by Rand and Robyn's youngest brother, Ryan, who wrote all the books in the library himself when he was just a senior in high school. Further games and novels would really enrich the basic story of the game. So let me get you caught up really quickly on the main game with a little of the later lore baked in that would make it come a bit more alive. Now, much of Myst's important beats start thousands of years ago with a race called the Dunny, spelled this way because the Millers found out too late that the word Dunny was Australian slang for shithouse. Nice. The Dunny, whose name in the lore means new beginning, not shithouse, lived in an underground cave system on Earth and knew the art, the ability to write books that would allow them access to worlds beyond their own called ages. Unfortunately for all their wondrous ability, the Dunny would be torn apart by plague, classism over the use of ages, and prejudice against the surface dwellers of Earth that some had tried to contact, ultimately leading to war that left their technologically advanced society in ruins. Atris, the descendant of the last survivors of the Dunny, is a quarter Dunny himself, and sought out refugees through the ages and relocated them to Relishan. He practiced the art with grace, getting to know the inhabitants of the worlds he unlocked and seeking to live peacefully with them. Myst itself is an age dreamed up by his wife Catherine, and it's where he taught his two sons Cirrus and Achenar the art. But once you reach Myst Island, you realize that something's gone wrong. The place is devoid of human life, and your only link to it are garbled, haunting transmissions somehow coming from inside of a red book and a blue book, which apparently act as magical prisons for two brothers named Cirrus and Achenar. They both blame the other for destroying their father Atris's many ages and for killing him, and ask you to retrieve the missing blue or red pages and return them to their respective book in order to free the person trapped inside. And both, suspiciously, like warning a forbidden fruit, tell you not to even touch the nearby green book or you'll be trapped forever. They're both telling the same story, but whom should you believe? The backstory of the Dunny isn't even in the game proper, so all you really know is that Atris is a benevolent traveler between worlds, loves his wife Catherine and his two sons, and seeks to train them up in the way they should go as future stewards of the ages. Beyond that, no real conflict or intrigue exists beyond anthropological, slice-of-life accounts of life in the ages. As it turns out, Atris was actually the last piece of the story puzzle for the Millers, as the game was initially just about two brothers, one good and one evil, whom you could decide between just as you can in the finished game.
I don't know where we got the idea for two brothers. It had to be subconscious on some sense, on some level.
Considering that Atris is the central protagonist of the entire Myst series, it's interesting that he was added in last thing as something of a plot balancer to make the moral choices of whom to show allegiance to more interesting. So, whom you side with influences which ending you get, but they are nearly identical in effect, and only a third ending related to the Green Book differs and is the canonical good ending, and we'll talk more about that later once we've gone over the puzzles and have adequately built up to this ending. But what's interesting to note is that while games like BioShock have been teased for having too binary a moral choice system, like should you save the little sisters or harvest them for resources, Myst isn't doing much more. Now, of course, 14 years separates these games, so that's more damning for BioShock to have not done more with this concept than Myst. But even back in the early 90s, the Millers were somewhat anxious about how deep their story was actually turning out to be. In Emily Yoshida's Grantland interview with the Millers, she observed that they were still, quote, coming up against a problem that video games are still dealing with today. Can the medium support stories and characters in the same way that a film or novel does? And is that even what the medium should do in its advanced iteration? It was the Millers' first instinct to make a place and to build a story around it, but even Robyn had to concede that despite that being their preference, it wasn't, quote, quite as powerful as what you'd feel with another character. The environment is like the other main character in this, and that's good, that's great, but the characters that we were creating were just kind of like every other video game. Robyn would later go on to say in a Field of View interview,
by the end of it, it felt a little, almost silly. However, I do think we achieved another thing, which is putting characters into a game and making them seem relatively believable. And that was enough.
Yoshida mostly agrees, but asked, how much do we really know about Atris and Catherine besides the broadest archetypes? How moved are we by their relationships and desires and fears? On the other hand, how much does a negative answer to those questions affect how memorable and emotional Myst was as a gaming experience? Myst didn't stage a drama for those of us who played. It gave us a stage in which to go through our own little interior dramas, whether that was being inexplicably terrified to go down an unfamiliar corridor, or inexplicably satisfied to discover a new vantage point of your surroundings that you hadn't known existed. You bring your own brain and baggage to all art, but that accounted for virtually all of the pleasures of Myst, and the extent of its laissez-faire attitude towards how you went about playing the game effectively turns you into the most advanced, complex, well-developed video game character ever.
Is he though?
Now, as deep as most of this is, it's not been my experience that the much vaunted moral choice conundrum is something that weighs on your mind as you play. Instead, it's more of a signal fire to pull you towards something in the emotional distance. All the while knowing that they plan to stop you over and over with puzzles and lore books to make you consider the truth of the brothers' account, and also what right that you, a stranger in a strange land, have to act as arbiter. Is it moral obligation that you as a person have to care, or just the function of needing a hook to incite the player to go out and quest? Now, this could seem like an intentionally navel-gazing waste of time question. Do I ask why I should kill demons in Doom or steal magic treasures and lavish manners in Thief? No, because it's cool and something you can't do in real life, which is why we game, right? But Myst, for all its hubbub about making you engage with moral quandaries, is a decidedly silent monolith inviting you to ask it what it wants and needs more often than not. And the version we've played here 30 years used to be even more so. The Millers realized that playtesters were often getting stuck or disinterested early on, so they added what Robyn said was a needed inciting incident, or what's known in literary circles as the event which introduces a crisis that must be solved by the story's protagonist. The inciting incident here was the note next to the walkway off the dock that said something to the effect of, "Something will happen if you flip all the switches on the island. Woo!"
And it introduced people to this new thing we added, a door right by the dock, and a message from our main character now, this person Atris. And Atris now gives the player a message and sends them on their quest.
This is all good stuff, but it is very sparse, and I remember back when I played as a child getting stuck pretty early on, just listening to the book transmissions over and over, hoping to jar something loose from the seemingly unusable island. I fiddled with the plates behind the fireplace, flicked through the switches again and again, flipped the dates in the planetarium to no avail, and played with the tower rotator in the library to see what would happen. Incidentally, the tower rotation map had to have the words tower rotation added later on in development because testers weren't even understanding the function of the device. And that's kind of been my experience with Myst gameplay more often than not. Part of it is that the contrivance of gamey things to do often necessitates an unreality. Like, the primary contrivance beyond how timing and technique-based some puzzles are is why in the world Atris would make these so hard to figure out when they were intended for his wife Catherine to solve. Are we to assume that she would just know so much more than a complete stranger about how Atris's mind works and how these things would operate? Perhaps, but again, it feels a little bit contrived. Now, I'll pen all this with the admission that I'm not a point-and-click adventure guy. I've seen way too many Mandalore Grimbeard videos to know that these games are much too moon logic-y for me to love, and you've heard me complain about puzzles in a variety of other games too. I may just not have the patience or mental inventiveness to get them, or just the desire to play that type of game, so I'll cede that point. So my analysis here today is more interested in whether the puzzles follow the rules that the Millers set out for themselves, versus simply just reporting that, I didn't like this, that seemed too hard. Wah! Then once we go through the gauntlet of actually playing Myst, we'll revisit the story as it concludes, and see how all these things tie together. So let's rock. Of Ages. Cleft for me. Let me hide myself in thee.
Seriously?
Yeah, that's my bad. I got a little carried away.
The Millers have an interesting relationship with immersion, story, and puzzle design. On one hand, they seem dedicated to making interesting, immersive puzzles that aid the story through interaction as opposed to exposition. On the other hand, the Millers express an almost begrudging obligation to include a story, but also to include actual gameplay challenges like puzzles at all. But then they also express that they wish they could unshackle the puzzles from the story and just make them more like arbitrary classic video game challenges. In a 2016 AV Club interview, Rand said that the puzzles are tough because there's so much tugging on it, you know? If we didn't have to worry about integrating them into the environment or making them part of the story, it would be just sweet. We could just do full-fledged puzzles and not have to mess with making them feel like they're here for a reason. Robyn described Myst puzzles as friction, a means to slow the player down and make them investigate and contemplate the world more seriously.
We were creating the game for essentially non-gamers. And non-gamers they don't like puzzles. So a good puzzle shouldn't feel like a puzzle. It should feel very familiar and not arbitrary. It should have a sense that it's just a part of the world. It's like a thrown breaker in your house. You know, what happens when the electricity goes out? Well, you go and you switch the breaker back on. And so we kind of did that as much as possible in Myst. And so, to a certain extent, I think Myst worked because of that. In fact, we made some really bad puzzles in Myst. There's one or two that just that suck. But there's some that are pretty good.
And while I agree that there are plenty of clever ones, some I feel are breaking the rule that puzzles only require common sense and observation to solve. So let's start off with the puzzles that feel like they're playing fair, even if they're hard to zero in on sometimes. And that all starts with Myst Island itself. Myst Island is a rather outrageous feat of engineering. A spaceship on one end, an old ship on the other, a boiler room, a dentist office that's somehow a planetarium, to a Victorian-looking library with awfully 20th century-looking architecture beneath it. Myst can feel like an abandoned amusement park sometimes, or an unguided tour through a kids' museum of pop-up widgets and gizmos that may or may not even do anything noteworthy when you click on them. You're constantly asked to read into what the disparate clues you find could possibly correlate to, since most clues are number or shape-based, and so many clue receptacles where you can enter such information seem awfully agnostic and open for most things that look like clues, like numbers. And that's not just my read. Brand estimates that less than half of the players ever made it off the initial island. Let me repeat that. Just getting into the first of 4 worlds was a challenge for half of its ginormous audience. At least, 500,000 players at the lowest estimate, just in the 90s? Now, to be fair, I got to Channelwood before getting stuck, and I did so when I was probably like 10 or 12, making my brother at the most 9 and my dad in his early 40s, and he'd hardly ever played a game. All that to say, it can't be that hard if we could do it, but that's still like a lot of players to leave behind that early. Part of the challenge is just how many clues are available at the outset, how many breadcrumb trails make themselves available to you and appear to be dead ends at first. Some puzzles work intuitively, and others I wish I could suss out. Let's visit a couple ages and see what they offer. Don't worry, I won't go puzzle by puzzle, but I do want to examine 4 in particular that give a wide range of what feel like a good fair puzzle, a decent puzzle that's tough, and then a couple that kind of feel like a bridge too far. Let's start with what's likely the first or second one the players will encounter, which is raising the ship up in the bay. In the center of the island sits a basin full of water with a model ship floating inside. Around it are numerous switches with symbols on them. To solve this puzzle, you'll need to find 3 dates in the elevator area below the library, comically put on the wall on a plaque. Very immersive there. These can be entered into the planetarium to show constellations visible on those days, and you can use a library book which has symbols associated with each constellation to suss out which of the 3 symbol switches you need to click on to make the model rise. I could never figure this out the hard way as a kid, but one of my little accomplishments was getting this thing to rise up just by randomly clicking around until I got the right combination. I appreciate the rewarding, interlocking nature of the clues in this puzzle, though, as an adult, and how it rewards your engagement with the world as a real place, while also providing an alternative solution as you might find, kind of in an immersive sim. So let's move on to the only age I ever got to when I was a kid. Let's go to Channelwood. Channelwood has a place deep in my heart. I remember my first time playing and reading the book in the library about Atris's travels here and how he even met another human, which was pretty unusual. He also befriended the native ape-like tree dwellers who lived in houses up in the trees, hence the name, and walked across the swamp on wooden walkways. They were kindly and worshipped humans as gods for some reason, perhaps because they'd met previous users of the art. They also spoke a different language that you can see an eloquent rendition of here. It's a wholesome place, and Atris even brought his sons here to train them in the use of the art. This age was pretty fundamental to the brothers becoming confident in their own abilities that they could be left alone in other ages too, but it also may have been the bed where their arrogance and lust for power was seated that led to the downfall of Myst before the player arrives. Also, what's really cool is that Rand modeled Channelwood after a swampy lake near his Texas house called Caddo Lake, and boy does it ever look just like it. Isn't that cool? Now the central puzzle here, and definitely not Caddo Lakewood, is rerouting the water supply to get a big pump working. Now I recently tinkered with this puzzle on the 2021 Xbox Remaster in 3D, and I still had trouble with it because the direction that the pipe says it's routing the water isn't clear based on the shape of the valve handle when you turn it. Now maybe I'm just dumb, and real-world knowledge of how valves work would educate me, but in-game I'm just pulling up blanks. Supposedly, the physicality of what you're looking at is irrelevant, though, as you can hear the water flowing inside the pipeline to indicate whether you've got the right configuration, but I guess my TV audio just wasn't up to the task because this totally flew under my radar. Wouldn't be the first time. This is hardly the hardest puzzle in Myst, though, but it shows that even a simpler one requires quite a bit of attention to creative detail that nowadays you just wouldn't anticipate developers designing around. I'll take the hit on this one. This is a decent little puzzle if you can get past the vague feedback, and then you can get to the good stuff, which is activating the elevators high above the swamps and the walkways between the tops of the trees. In tandem with the lush ambient noise, Channelwood feels tropical, Amazonian, transportive, though perhaps that's my Amazon Trail nostalgia kicking in too.
I had a dream that you would come here.
I remember being so affected by the emptiness of the place, but also excited, anxious to catch a glimpse of the tree dwellers high up in the trees above, almost like some scene out of Predator.
There's something in those trees.
There's just this discordant sense of unease that permeates each world like this, ones that should be bursting to life and instead seem stuck in time, devoid of living creatures. But yeah, just really good stuff, and it's the first image that comes to mind outside of Myst Island when reminiscing about this game. Okay, so Channelwood's my favorite age, and its puzzle is fairly approachable, right? So now let's travel to the ages that I'm not as familiar with and see how their puzzle design fares. In fact, let's highlight what I believe are kind of the tweener puzzles, the ones that feel like they're maybe a bit too esoteric, even if their intentions and design philosophy are good. I'm talking the Lighthouse puzzle in the Stoneship Age and the Gear puzzle. Let's go to Stoneship first, since that's the one I've recently played through on the Xbox. The Stoneship Age is great looking, but not for the faint of intellect. You enter the lighthouse and have to drain the water from the lower levels to make a chest emerge and get what's inside. The trick is that the control panel is very far away from what it actually controls and is actually outside of it, and it has multiple levers whose inputs activate the innermost workings of both the water level and the spiral staircase inside the lighthouse. Each operate on timers, so you have to rush into the lighthouse just to even see what your shot in the dark lever pulling even did, much less what you'd want to do before it returns to its previous state. And the fact that the game assumes you'll know you can somehow pump up the chest with water to make it buoyant and rise to the top for your use is a wild one to me. Visually, there's not much pointing towards this being possible, much less desirable, except this curious valve on the chest itself that you can flip back and forth. It's also a little contrived to me, at least if you're supposedly pushing narrative justification and believability, but then make it to where you can't just crack open the damn chest when it's right in front of you. No, I gotta boop 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 it up to the top to get the chain key to reach it. Okay. And don't even get me started on the absolutely mental next stage of this age, where you have to use those switches again to drain water and open multiple doors blindly in a maze of corridors, at the center of which is like a horizontal Ferris wheel looking thing with 20 bulbs or so on it, and only one of which you need to click because it's facing the direction you found the lighthouse in. But good luck on knowing which direction that is beneath the surface with no ability to see out. This age is kind of my pet peeve, and it's often the second age I go to when playing, so that's why it feels like the game escalating beyond a reasonable amount, at least for me. But our next ages in puzzle are infamous amongst even the die-hard fan base. Let's hit our first one, the Gear puzzle we mentioned earlier that even Robyn said was bad. Simply put, the Gear puzzle is one of those classic line up the rows kinds of puzzles, but of course some rows move multiple rows when used, so you've got to figure out how they move relative to each other to get the right configuration. But Myst's wrinkle is that in order to make all three gears line up with the correct combination of numbers, you have to find a secret technique and hold down the lever longer instead of just clicking and releasing like a normal game action. It sounds simple to say and comprehend, but it's hardly intuitive just based on what you've seen up to this point. And you'd maybe only think in this paradigm if you perchance were just in Stoneship dealing with those maddening timing-based outputs from the control panel. So this one you're kind of either solving or you're not, so it seems a bit corny to me. But our next puzzle is one that seems like it's adequately built towards by context clues, but has proven to be the most infamous puzzle in the whole game, and that's the Maze Runner puzzle in the Selenitic Age. Specifically, the sounds you hear that are supposed to indicate a specific direction and guide you out of the maze. Now technically we've heard these sounds before. In the Mechanical Age, we hear them while playing around with the little simulator thing that orients itself around the 4 cardinal directions, which each make a different noise once the needle crosses them. But the price of freedom to do these puzzles in any order is that you can simply not have seen the Mechanical Age before the Selenitic, and thus won't have any contextual basis to assume sound means direction. And it's easy to lose track of those sounds too as they come up early on, and you've got this really cool War of the Roses looking pageantry to take in as well, with all these mounted swords and even, my goodness, is that an ape head on the wall? And this space is actually based on a fortress that Rand drew for his childhood D&D sessions. There's also a funny long-time running Myst fandom thing about what's actually in the box in Akinar's secret chamber.
Oh, what's in the box? What's in the fucking box?
Its artist Chuck Carter, who also did the Selenitic Age, said that the amorphous blob in there was supposed to be a rotting monkey's head.
No! No!
God, sorry we asked, dude. That is dark. I mean, this makes some sense, though, as it looks just like the mounted ape head on the wall over there. Oh, you know what I just thought about? I really hope that's not one of the tree dwellers in Channelwood. Oh my god.
No!
Anyway, back to the sounds as they relate to the Selenitic Age and the Maze Runner puzzle. Technically speaking, Rand set a precedent that sound means direction. And it goes a step further by making the entirety of the puzzles that open the age and also occupy the top half of it based on sound too, which I can imagine is an immersive and exciting educational opportunity for a game designer. At the top level of Myst Island, you'll take the now open stairwell down to a classic switch puzzle where each button ramps up the voltage a certain amount, much like Signalis did recently. The solution is also found at the top of a ladder on a plaque, which, as I said before, just kind of screams contrivance. Atris apparently was very non-committal about whether he wanted the puzzles to be outrageously esoteric or painfully obvious. It's just kind of funny to see these very gamey-looking writing that could only be clues and require an okay then ladder to get to. Very immersive friction you've got there, guys. But at least the keyboard puzzle manages to feel like smart game theory and justifiable world design. Now, if we were inquisitive enough, we first saw these keys that Myst wants us to click on highlighted in one of the library books, and there's a keyboard and a switchboard on the opposite wall, so you can click on the keys as the book prescribes, see what sound it makes, then tune the switchboard to make those same sounds to unlock the Selenitic Age. So here we have a precedent that sound is at least related to this age, and that's where Rand's thoughts in that AV Club interview come in to defend the rest of the Selenitic Age's progression of this core concept. I think the implementation was slightly flawed, but I love it, and it's the crazy maze runner from Myst. There was a certain elegance to that puzzle that I think people don't understand. I love the fact that people play through an entire world that has everything to do with sound, and then they go down to this vehicle at the bottom of the world, and they forget about it. And we're still giving them sound clues for what to do. Now, I see where Rand and company are coming from, but the execution of these good ideas doesn't do them justice, which he even cedes some ground on. Let's enlist the help of Reddit user IHateDRM, on this topic, who put together a really solid map and analysis for us to look at, and a breakdown of what seems to have gone wrong here. So as designers, the Millers had it in their heads that the player would be taught from several places that 4 different sounds mean 4 different directions, and any combination of sounds would be just like saying south and west sounds combined to make southwest sound, and that would become the direction the game is telling you to go to solve the maze, right? Well, you can brute force your way through, technically speaking, just like you can the ship racing puzzle in Myst Island, but here it's much harder to get lucky as there are so many places to make a mistake. But, even if you're on the Miller's wavelength, there are still some false positives as to the sounds properly indicating direction, making you doubt the validity of the feedback you're getting and possibly leaving you kind of stuck in limbo. So let's say you're driving along in your little minecart, woody-doody-doo,
And you're driving along, la-li-la, woo.
And you go through the first 3 nodes, which are linear, and you get taught the sounds for north and west. Okay, nice. Nodes 4 and 5 teach you east, and then 6 is where you get your first complication. You can either go south or northeast. If you don't go south, which is the right way, you go northeast into node 6A and hear a north sound. So you go that way, but it's a dead end, which plays no sound. Dead ends making no sound is good. That tells you something unique. But telling us which way to go that leads us to that dead end in the first place if you go far enough off the right path is just simply the game lying to you. This could happen in 6A, 7A, 8A, 11A, 12A, or 13A. So essentially, anything but Goldilocksing your way through the whole thing ends up being even more confusing than it already was, because the wrong path says to keep going a ways down the wrong route, but ends up leading nowhere. IHateDRM even shows us a clip of a Let's Player getting accidentally getting accidentally fooled by this weird feedback.
North? This is peculiar.
I also noticed in the playthrough that I'm using for footage that the player there, who was intimately familiar with the game and basically speedran it, still took quite a bit of time to get through this maze. Now let's be real here. Everything I've seen indicates that this is the least liked puzzle by Myst fans. Robyn says it's bad, and Rand staunchly defends it, but even says it isn't perfect. And I want to like it. It's cool how it references sound in other ages, but it's unlikely that most players will connect those dots, and it's made even more tenuous that they would ever suss it out when given feedback from the maze itself that breaks its own rules. Now, Rand indicated that their puzzle philosophy is that once the player finds the solution, if they blame us, then we haven't done a good job. If they blame themselves, then we have. In other words, if we build a connection so that at the end of the puzzle they go, oh yes, I should have gotten that, then I think we've done our job well. Now, revisiting Myst for this video has revealed that many more puzzles than I thought were certainly doable, especially in the time they came out where puzzles asked a lot more of the player. But I do think the Maze Runner puzzle especially is not one the player can blame themselves for, no matter how many context clues the Millers built in earlier. It just isn't internally consistent enough, so it being a cool idea doesn't mean it's a great puzzle overall. Now, I don't say that to trash or to mock Myst, but it's definitely a feature to make note of, while playing this game 30 years after release. Let's also remember Rand's estimation that probably half of Myst players never got off the initial island. Even for its time, Myst was a little heady and obscure in its logic relative to the market. And that's why I have some trouble going back and playing through Myst. I don't find it particularly enjoyable mechanically speaking, even with the guidebook open telling me what to do, which of course takes the fun out of a puzzle game. But I do love being in Myst. I love what the guys were going for, the sense of place and atmosphere that's like playing through a Dinotopia book or something with its fascinatingly weirdo technology, its wub sound effects, and its fascinatingly goofy lore and acting. To Myst Advantage, though, the adventure game casual in me paradoxically finds its aloofness and incomprehensibility part of its charm. Kind of like the more it hides its face from me like a holy mystery, it's also compelling me to keep searching for answers. There's a good life lesson in there that you don't have to know everything, but you should never stop trying to improve, never feel like you've arrived, never settle for who you are as the best you ever need to be. I relate that some to my frustration about what I want this channel to be, at least over the past year. Now don't get me wrong, 2023 was a great year in many, many ways. I got to meet my baby nephew, many friends and family announced pregnancies, and I had the Alone in the Dark go a little viral early on that really leveled up the audience that I had. But I'm frustrated that despite feeding the algorithm what I thought it wanted with Alan Wake or Signalis and things like that, I wasn't able to affect a similar outcome or feel that I was in control of my own destiny any more than before. Myst came to me at a good time this year because I found comfort in Rand's appraisal of Myst's success. He says, I now realize a lot of it, a majority of it, had to do with luck. And I think that's how the world works. I think a lot of people work very hard and they don't get lucky. Don't confuse luck with any sort of elevated view of yourself. You were in the right place at the right time and did a lot of hard work, but a lot of people do hard work. It worked for you. Be grateful and don't think too much of yourself. People ask me all the time if Myst was art, and I think art with a capital A for me has this intent to communicate truth. You become a master craftsman at what you do, you can now try to communicate some kind of truth. And truth is a simple thing. It's just, something about the world around you, something about yourself. So I guess humility is the equalizer. Entitlement to repeat success is one of the worst human qualities out there because it doesn't let you enjoy things honestly unless they're about you. Attempt to communicate truth honestly and without trying to harangue the details into a convenient arrangement so you can look good, and your conscience will be clean and what you say will attract the right kind of people. And since we're talking about truth, I guess now is a good time to reveal the truth at the end of Myst's story, which speaks to this intellectual exercise we're having. So all this time we've been solving puzzles to collect the missing pages, which will free whichever brother we choose from their prison. But each brother's telling the same story, so it's hard to know whom to believe. And it turns out that no matter whom you pick, they betray you and imprison you in their book. The good ending is to make sure you find the white page before interacting with the green book that the brothers forbade you to touch. And then, like an inverse Garden of Eden, you open the book to find Atreus alive and well, trapped here by his sons in a mad power grab for the ages. While somewhat aloof, Atreus is a classic, benevolent, altruistic, almost Christ-like figure who returns to his work of trying to restore the ages to their former glory and handle the punishment of his wicked sons. Now, I hope I'm not presuming, but considering that the Millers were the sons of a pastor who instilled in them a healthy interest in debating their own beliefs and viewpoints, I'm inclined to think that there's at least a little bit of their dad's thoughtfulness in Atreus, a man who must maintain benevolent influence over people who are listening to him and trusting him with his power. I say this because their father seems influential in their lives, but also because Rand and Robyn both greatly respect the power and potential of artists and influencers, both to create but also to destroy. Rand said that he and his brother subscribed to what J.R.R. Tolkien called being a sub-creator. To Tolkien, who was a Christian, God created him in his image, and thus human art became an act of holy imitation that mirrored and honored the miracle of creation right back at him. Rand called this phenomenon a really powerful thing, and it's good to stay a little humble with a powerful thing. So creating creating Myst wasn't simply a self-expressionistic endeavor, but a means of shouting out to a grander scheme. And by engaging in a great thing, it wasn't a means to become entitled or preachy, but to be humbled by all the greatness that had come before and the nobility of pursuing such a thing with earnestness and respect, knowing the power to influence is a great responsibility that can help and heal as much as it could corrupt. Of course, not every piece of art that you make is capital A art. I'm not like some charlatans out there that think just because you hit the upload button that whatever you made is wonderful, that it's, fucking Tennessee Williams or something. But understanding our world enough to create worlds within it that ring true are what most of us are doing every time we relate a weird thing that happened at work to our spouse, or tell a joke, or lay bricks, or sing opera, or create a video game, or make a video about said video game. So keep the faith. Don't compete against anyone but who you wish to be, and make sure you love what you do enough to attract the right kind of people that will appreciate you on your terms. Then, and only then, you might just hear Atris's voice saying in the back of your mind,
"You've done the right thing."
I wish the gaming industry would learn from the Millers' approach and for what made Myst successful. Its contemporary competitors were flabbergasted by Myst's success and how it seemed to generate its own brand new market out of thin air and ride that to preposterous success, so maybe Myst was a bit of a unicorn. But it stayed with us because it enchants us with rewarding mental work and incredible visual and auditory sensations that make you feel like the world can be reached towards and felt. Myst Impact should be credited to the remarkable ingenuity, too, of the Millers and their unsung backups in Chuck Carter and Chris Brandkamp, who persevered through multiple tech adjustments and restrictions like hard drive space, incredibly slow renders, and little beyond sheer gumption and cocksureness that would give them any indication that they would even find an audience. That's why 30 years later we've seen countless remakes and remasters, and we're even getting a really cool sounding documentary by Shane Miller you can probably still back on Kickstarter if you'd like to get a copy when it releases. There's even a Myst TV show that's supposed to be coming out in the next couple of years. There's still a bunch of untapped potential with this franchise, and I'm sure the Millers are tickled pink that it's still a fount of inspiration. They still seem a bit humbled by their success even after experiencing 3 decades of it. Robyn revealed that we made Myst, and we never expected it to continue on this many years later especially. Now it's so much larger than Myst. It's got a life of its own. There are so many people who are involved, whether it's creating, writing their own stories about it, or painting pictures, or having guilds, or the Mysterium, an annual celebration of the game, getting together every year. It just goes on and on and on. It's this world that exists out there, this massive thing that is much larger than the Myst games. We feel privileged and humbled to be a part of that, privileged and humbled to have been there at the beginning. And while Robyn left the company after Riven in 1997, Rand stayed on as CEO of Cyan and has been making similar experiences to Myst ever since, like Abduction and The Firmament. But he's noticed the industry's lost that garage band feeling that he had during Myst, and I'd agree.
Everything has shifted in the industry. In a lot of ways, I'm really happy in the ways it shifted. I mean, I started with my brother doing this little indie kind of thing that we felt we could do by ourselves. And then we've watched the trend in gaming go to a place where the only people who could make games were enabled by large amounts of money from large corporations who were publishers. And that was in some ways sad because, I mean, luckily we were on the right side of that. We had our funding from Myst and we could keep going, but it felt like the whole industry lost some kind of innovation by the guys in the garage, by that indie feeling.
Now sure, a lot of that loss has to be chalked up with the fact that the industry's been riding on the shoulders of giants like the Millers or Romero or Carmack or Spectre or whoever, who got there first with those big innovations and those formative experiences that helped propel the gaming industry into a multi-billion-dollar one. But it's so obvious that the industry has to remember how to get back to the garage, so to speak. There were thousands of layoffs between this year and last year. The budgets are just too high, the work's too often done by mercenary workers instead of cultivated talent, and nearly everyone's trend chasing these days with live service integration or lazily applying skill trees and open worlds and every other cliche to achieve maximum gaming fun. Hell, even Remedy Entertainment reported that they felt obligated to elongate Alan Wake 2 with side content to satisfy the players' expectations of value. And let's be honest, the side content in the game is okay, but it's hardly essential and often fairly repetitive. Control is the same way, despite being an otherwise pretty sweet game. So, it affects even the best of us. This is an industry that's done nothing but complain recently that games are too expensive to make while constantly increasing scope and budget. You can't have it both ways. Get back to making games that will sell just fine and don't cost an arm and a leg to make. And for the love of God, stop putting the cart before the horse, or we're going to have fewer and fewer instances of greatness and so much fine to terrible that we'll start forgetting what excellence means unless we go back years and years. That's why things like Myst don't have to reinvent the wheel every year to stay relevant. In a world where we constantly are told to craft for an audience, instead of making something authentic that an audience worth having will come to, the Millers just made the game they wanted to play, and the audience showed up. Hell, it was even conceptualized as a game for non-gamers, and it technically was, as grandmothers and more came to the table. But it also created a new type of gaming fan, one that appreciated something that felt like an epiphany of sorts, a refreshing change of pace that transformed what we thought was possible in interactive entertainment. Myst became its own flavor, so different in spice that people failed to replicate it very well or keep making their own flavor in response. It wasn't a plague that wiped out the rest of the games like it. It was simply a better way of life that adventure gamers were used to, and it weirded them out, rightly so. But it speaks to the ingenuity of Cyan that they were able to reinvigorate the game with unconventional methods, an adaptable determination against technological limits, and a love of craft, of sub-creation, to bring something wonderful out of their imaginations that they enjoyed so much that they wanted it to be ours too. What more shining example could there be for our beloved but ramshackle industry to aspire to? Now, if bigwigs like Microsoft or Embracer Group can't see the value in this, then they're missing the point of why we're all here in the first place.
I know my apprehensions might never be allayed, and so I close, realizing that perhaps the ending has not yet been written.
Thanks for watching. A big shout out to Cyan for making this game come to life and changing the landscape forever, and a big shout out to my dad, without whom I wouldn't even have known that Myst existed. And a huge shout out to those of you generous enough to support my work by subscribing to my Patreon. I have to thank Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Hey Blondie, and He Acts Show for their contributions, and I have to make a special point to thank the Nth Review and James Wyatt for subscribing to my highest Patreon tier and for giving me great advice and encouragement over the years. And please welcome a brand new and very generous Patreon M to our ranks. Super glad to have you here. Thanks for coming along. And if you'd like to be a part of the reason this channel gets bigger and better, feel free to go over to patreon.com/highfunctioningmedium, where you can become a YouTube channel member, or if you prefer, you can donate at Ko-fi. And if you'd like free ways to support the channel, I also have a GOG affiliate link and NordVPN affiliate link. God bless you everyone, and I'll see you soon.